Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is the first of a few videos seeking to add some clarity to the recent discussion I had with some Christians on the topic of Herem and human sacrifice. The link to the discussion is at the top of your screen and also in the description. In his response to my presentation, Luis Dizon discussed some of the verses I had cited and attempted to refute the claim that Herem was akin to human sacrifice. One such verse was 1 Samuel 15:3. Luis made the following response.
First, we have Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 15. This is one of the passages that has already been cited. So Herem language does come up in verse 3. So you can see here, it's vahachari ramtem, so prescribe. And then if we go down to verses 7 through 8, okay, and I'll just read the English translation. Saul destroyed Amalek from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is close to Egypt, and he captured King Agag of Amalek alive. He proscribed all the people, putting them to the sword. But Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the second-born, the lambs, and all else that was of value. They would not proscribe them. They proscribed only what was cheap and worthless. So notice something. Saul is not putting the best of the animals under the Herem, and we will shortly see why he does this. So in verse 15, after Samuel answered why he did not put the animals under Herem, Saul answers, they were brought from the Amalekites, for the troops spared the choices of the sheep and oxen for sacrificing to the Lord your God, and we proscribe the rest. So in this one passage, we have a clear distinction between proscribing and sacrificing. So the reason these animals were not given as a herem is so that they can be given as a zevach instead. So already we're starting to see the argument fall apart, because if a herem is a sacrifice, then what is the point behind this distinction? And that goes on if we go down to verse 21 onwards. I prescribed Amalek, and the troops took from the spoil some sheep and oxen, the best of what had been prescribed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Once again, Saul is trying to make excuses for his actions. But then Samuel says this, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much in obedience to the Lord's command? Surely obedience is better than sacrifice, compliance than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, defiance like the iniquity of teraphim. Because you rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king. This would make no sense if the harem and the zebach were the same, because it's clearly stated that the Lord does not want a zevach, he wants obedience to his command, and his command is to give herem. Also, if those two things were analogous or similar to each other, Saul could simply say, well, I am fulfilling the herem, I'm just doing it by way of a zebach. But of course, because the Bible does not equate these two things, such an excuse would not work, and Saul does not attempt to offer it.
So Luis does make a good point. 1 Samuel 15, verse 21, does seem to differentiate between Herem, or devoting the Amalekites to destruction, and actual sacrifices. But does it follow that when Herem is mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, in other books, it also must be distinct from sacrifice because the book of Samuel makes that distinction? The answer, of course, is no. It could just be that in 1 Samuel, this distinction is made, while in other books, the distinction is not so clear. This important point was made by Susan Nidich in her book, War in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars have observed that the biblical understanding of Herem does have variations. One is the Herem being a ban as sacrifice, and another is the Herem being a ban as God's justice. According to Nidich, in the Bible, the concept of the ban as God's justice seems to overpower the concept of the ban as sacrifice. Of course, that implies that the understanding of the ban as sacrifice is still present. Nevertheless, in some verses, where the emphasis is on God's justice, there are still indications of the sacrificial element. As Nidis explains, the ban as sacrifice ideology remains and predominates, but is joined by indications that the ban is also perceived as an imposition of divine justice. Now, in 1 Samuel 15, verse 21, even though Saul tries to excuse the sparing of the animals as a sacrifice to God, which Luis claims shows a clear distinction with the Herem, Niditch observes that the Hebrew word for sacrifice refers to those types where the animal is actually consumed, in other words, eaten, rather than completely burned. Thus, in that sense, it was not a burnt offering type of sacrifice. Also, Luis ignored the sacrificial and cultic references towards the end of 1 Samuel 15. Verse 33, one of the most violent verses in the Bible in my opinion, states that Samuel himself executed the Amalekite king Agag in a horrifyingly brutal way. He hacked him to pieces. But notice the phrase, before the Lord in Gilgal. Niditch, who renders Samuel's violence as hewing rather than hacking, states, the verb for hewing is used only here, but the image of cutting in pieces is strongly reminiscent of the ritual preparation of sacrificial animals, an image strengthened by the phrase, before the Lord at Gilgal, a cult center. It appears that Agag's killing is given a cultic or ritualistic tinge. That Gilgal was a cult center and a place of sacrifice is made clear in the book of 1 Samuel itself. For example, in chapter 10, verse 8, it states that Samuel planned to go to Gilgal to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice peace offerings to God. Even in chapter 15, verse 21, Saul himself emphasizes that the best Amalekite animals were spared because they were going to be sacrificed to God in Gilgal. Finally, compare the language in 1 Samuel 15, verse 33, where Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal, to Leviticus 1, verse 5. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord. There seems to be a deliberate ritualizing of Agag's brutal execution. So, while 1 Samuel 15 does make a distinction between Herem and sacrifice, as Luis pointed out, the Herem on Agag and his eventual execution still have a sacrificial hint to them. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وقل جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا